Welcome to Learn to Live Stress-Free. This is Christine Wright with Dr. Robert Wright, Jr., your go-to wellness coaches of www.stressfreenow.info.
Today, we are fortunate to have Professor Dr. Allan Leslie Combs with us again to discuss his perspectives on integral consciousness and the Wilbur-Combs matrix model.
Dr. Combs is the first endowed chair Doshi Professor of Transformative Studies and Director of the Center for Consciousness Studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. His background is in consciousness studies, neuropsychology, and systems science. He also holds appointments at the Saybrook University and is Director of the Consciousness Evolution Program and the Graduate Institute of Connecticut. He is also Professor Emeritus at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He is author of over 200 articles, chapters, and books on consciousness and the brain, including The Radiance of Being, Understanding the Grand Integral Vision, Living the Integral Life, winner of the Best Book Award of the Scientific and Medical Network of the UK with a foreword by Ken Wilber, Synchronicity Through the Eyes of Science, Myth and the Trickster with Mark Holland, Consciousness Explained Better Toward an Integral Understanding of the Multifaceted Nature of Consciousness, The Victorian's Guide to Consciousness, The Post-Conventional Personality, Empirical Perspectives on Higher Development with Angela Pfaffenberger and Paul Marco, and Dreamer of the Earth, The Relevance of Thomas Berry, Prophetic Visionary, with Ernest Laszlo. Dr. Combs is the founder of the Consciousness Society, a co-founder of the Society for Chaos Theory in Psychology and the Life Sciences, a member of the General Evolution Research Group, and the 100-member Club of Budapest. He is co-editor of the Journal of Consciousness Evolution and associate editor of Dynamical Psychology. Professor Combs was the winner of the 2002-2003 National Teaching Award of the Association of Graduate Liberal Studies Programs, and in the same year held the UNCA Honorary Ruth and Leon Feldman Professorship.
Welcome, Leslie. We're so glad that you could join us again today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, Leslie. Welcome.
Thank you.
Leslie, since some of our listeners may not be familiar with the term integral consciousness, can you define it for our audience and explain how the average individual might be affected by this concept and why they should care about it or even want to know more about it?
Well, one of the ideas that a lot of people seem to be talking about these days is how to maximize your experience in a kind of optimal way and how to bring all the different parts of your person together in an optimal, functional kind of way. In other words, how to be a healthy whole person. And the idea of integral is an old idea, but it's really gotten new shoes, as it were, over the last couple of decades, especially with Ken Wilber's writings. He's written, I don't know how many books and been published very widely, and talks a lot about integral consciousness. There are other people who have talked about it previously as well, so it's not a new idea, but the idea is to bring the different elements of the mind or of consciousness together. Probably more people are familiar with Ken Wilber's notion of integral consciousness than anyone else, and he has a system, sort of a philosophical system in which he divides up our perspectives on ourselves and on the world into four different quadrants, and that would be a whole discussion in and of itself, but basically two of the quadrants are subjective, they're inner. They have to do with inner experience, and two of the quadrants are external, and they have to do with our perception and experience of the outside world, the objective world. And when these all come together, integral consciousness would be bringing all these together so that you would be a kind of a unified person. There are other ideas. One of the older ideas is that, and one I'm particularly fond of, is that it brings all the different ways that we experience reality together. The German historian Jean Gebser was the person who introduced the idea that over the long course of history, people have experienced a period of what he called magical consciousness, a period in which magical ideas dominated. And he didn't mean that in any negative way. He meant it in a very positive way, that the world was miraculous in a way that it isn't for most modern people. And a period of mythical consciousness, and you really see this in classical Greece and Egypt and so on, where gods and goddesses ruled and really made the fundamental decisions about what's real and what's not real. And then the modern mind is much more rational and prone towards deduction and so on. And the idea, integral consciousness from this point of view, is that it's bringing all those together, the magical, mythical, mental, and in plain English what that means is one can celebrate one's spiritual and religious experiences, at the same time be a thoughtful, rational person with your feet on the ground of reality, and experience the miraculous in your life in many different ways. Falling in love is a miraculous experience, for example. So that's a somewhat different notion, and really a less, I think, rational, if I can put it that way, notion of integral than the one Ken Wilber writes about, although Ken doesn't really entirely disagree with it. There are all different ways of seeing how people are unified. In fact, the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I teach and where Bob here recently got a PhD, was really founded on the work of the Indian philosopher Sri Aurobindo and his partner, commonly known as the Mother, and way back in the first half of the 20th century, they really were one of the first to write about integral consciousness, and they simply meant mind, body, and spirit. So bringing all those together, and they were interested in bringing the spirit into the mind, which most profoundly spiritual people and traditions will be interested in, but also transforming the physical body as well. So they were interested in bringing the spirit all the way down, as you might say, through the mind and into the body, and transforming the whole system. So those are all different ideas of integral consciousness. My own view is that any way you use the term is fine, just tell us what you mean. There's really no absolute definition of integral consciousness. And I've talked to Ken about this as well. He's a very meticulous guy, and he keeps updating his definition with new information, which is fine with me, but, I don't view integral consciousness as any kind of absolute truth or any kind of absolute state. It's just an idea.
Your definition, makes perfect sense to me.
Thank
as
you.
someone who enjoys her own magical thinking. So
yeah.
The idea of, of the whole and having these aspects makes perfect sense to me. Now,
Right.
Leslie, in terms of the Wilbur-Combs matrix, or as you sometimes like to call it, the Combs-Wilbur matrix, can you explain where you would place the concepts of stress, anxiety, and grief in the matrix model?
Yeah, well, the model is just a way to look at different states of consciousness that one might experience, dreaming, waking. Originally, I included any kind of states you wanted, drug states, trance states, ecstatic spiritual states, states of boredom, whatever you like. But a state of consciousness is kind of a whole way of experiencing reality that even though it's hard to, for example, it's hard to define exactly how dreaming is different than waking consciousness. There's hardly anybody ever makes a mistake of thinking they're dreaming when they're awake, although I guess there are a few very, very rare cases of that pathology. But the basic idea is that people will interpret experiences that they have, and where we were particularly interested in spiritual experiences or revelations or whatever you might be interested in a kind of spiritual way, that those would be interpreted through the state one is in, and also in terms of one's personal growth and development. So, for example, a child might have a profound spiritual experience and interpret that as seeing Jesus or seeing angels or being visited by an angel. Someone who is much older might interpret it differently. They might say, I just became aware that the whole world is alive and there's a kind of unity to everything. There's beauty in everything I see. People experience things differently according not only to the state of consciousness that the experience comes out of, but probably more importantly, in terms of the matrix and why people were interested in it, is it has to do with their own way of understanding the world in terms of their own growth and development as well. So this was very important to Ken Wilber, for example, because he found it early on, you can find his writing, he found it absolutely impossible to believe that young children had deeply spiritual experiences, because he thought they only come along when one is mature enough to have them, you know. Now with the matrix, the way I had drawn it, you suddenly say, oh yeah, children can have profoundly spiritual experiences, as I think everybody knows or has known since the beginning of the time, except maybe for Ken Wilber for a few days. But then he said, oh yeah, he said, that's right, the children can have these powerfully religious experiences, but they
you were just having too much fun with that one, Leslie.
Yeah, well, I couldn't figure out at first why he had owned the idea so strongly. Now, he had basically stumbled onto it himself as well, but I don't think he early on realized how important it could be. And he was back in the corner with this thing about child spirituality. People were ready to throw stones at him. What kind of an ogre are you anyway? You know, what about the transcendentalists? You know, like Emerson, they thought children, you know, one of the poets come into this world trailing, what is it? Well, basically it's the image of an angel coming into the world trailing clouds of glory. Maybe that's what it. And here's Wilber says, oh, you might as well talk about a worm. I think it's one of the things he actually said.
Well, the image that you conjured up in my mind was Alice through the looking glass.
Yeah. Well, once he got onto that, he said, wait a minute, I've been wrong. So it's one of the few times he ever really made a big turn. And he said, well, no, children can have these wonderful experiences, but they will talk about it like a child does. And I don't think there's any real dispute about that. So I think that was one of the important findings of the matrix. It probably, the matrix itself isn't as big a deal as it might have seemed at first, but it does give you a way to talk about, for any given experience, what state of consciousness it comes from. You know, for example, we've all had dream experience. You ever have a dream in which something happened you thought was incredibly funny? It used to happen to me when I was a kid. Wake up laughing, and then I would think, well, what was funny about that? I remember one time somebody in a dream gave me an apple, and it was half eaten, and it was just hilarious. I laughed and laughed, woke up laughing, and 20 minutes later was asking myself, what was funny about that? I can't even figure it out. Well, it's a different state of consciousness. So take into account that different states of consciousness really present the world to us in different ways, and that our own level of maturity and sophistication will help us a great deal in how we interpret that is what the matrix is all about. And the example I often give, and probably mentioned in our last interview, is the experience so common among astronauts of getting out in space and seeing the Earth is a great blue-green ball, and seeing the beauty of the cosmos in the background. And they came back, a lot of them came back really inspired. But what they did with that was quite different. One or two of them became very dedicated fundamentalists. What's his name, started the Institute of Noetic Studies to study a larger understanding of the cosmos. For him, what he had experienced is a kind of unified cosmic vision, but one that still was in his purview of science and understanding through science. So that's the point, that depending on the person and their own experience, they'll interpret these things differently. So this leads to a whole different way of looking at religion as well, because religious experiences then sort out according to this matrix. So that's basically the idea there.
Okay, very true. Thank you so much, Leslie. I mean, as you said, it's in the experience and the interpretation, and then the communication of it that you will have the richness and the differences, and then the work to understand. The translation.
Of course, what happens is people will argue about, well, they had a valid view, but somebody else didn't, and so that creates a lot of problems. We can talk
Great,
all day
Leslie.
about that.
At this point, I'd like to acknowledge the recent passing of Carl Pribram.
Yeah.
Since Carl Pribram was such a mental giant, Leslie, and widely acclaimed, and he was so widely read and published. Can you tell our audience a little bit about Carl's life and your interactions with him, and the impacts that his findings had on the study of the brain and consciousness?
Yeah, sure. Carl was one of the real pioneers in brain science here in the U.S., although I think he was born and had his early life in Austria and the Czech Republic. Carl came here and he studied as a young man under a psychologist by the name of Carl Lashley. Carl Lashley was perhaps the greatest, what we call biopsychologist or brain psychologist of the first half of the 20th century. He was at Harvard. Harvard set out early in the 20th century to hire the best psychology department that money could buy, and they hired Carl Lashley and shut down the search. They had what they wanted. Lashley was famous for looking for memory in the brain, and he was one of the great early experimentalists, and Carl Pribram really studied with him. And Carl Pribram also was one of the 12 first licensed neurosurgeons in the United States back in the early part of the 20th century. He also was director of what was called the Yerkes Primate Laboratory. It's still there. I think there are several branches of it, but it's a major center for doing primate research, monkeys and chimpanzees and so on. So Carl had quite an early experience in studying the brain. He's said to have revised and updated, modernized the surgical methods. In those days, it was much more common to do brain surgery of different kinds on animals to discover what the different areas of the brain actually do, because they didn't have any of the modern techniques like MRIs and that kind of thing, magnetic resonance imagery, or even the X-rays. So he revised the surgical procedures to make them much more like human procedures, that is, in terms of cleanliness and anesthetics and so on. So that was Carl's early start. He was a brilliant guy. He went through several schools. He was at several universities. He ended up at Stanford, and he had a lifetime National Science Foundation award. I don't know that anybody has these anymore. What this meant in plain English is he never had to ask for money. He always had a lot of money to do his research, and he was very productive during the mid-20th century and working pretty much straight through the brain from the frontal lobe right on down through the structures of the brain, including the emotional brain in the middle, what's called the paleomammalian brain or limbic system. But He did a lot of early research on that, and then right on back to the visual and sensory areas near the back. It was all really classical and pioneering work that he did, and it was more than most people do in a lifetime. But eventually he got older, and at 65, he was forced to retire from the University of California system. I think that was back in the 70s or early 80s. At that time, there was a law in California in the state institutions that you had to retire at 65, which was sort of a joke for him because he continued to be very productive right up to 95, but at other places. But he had to leave. He went to Radford University in Virginia, Roanoke, which is where I met him actually at a Jean Gebser conference about consciousness. And it turns out he was quite interested in Gebser, and he was quite interested in consciousness. And he also was a good friend of Arthur Koestler, who some of the listeners will recognize as a major intellectual figure of the 20th century, one of the survivors of the death camps, who wrote all kinds of different books as time went on. Very, very bright guy. But anyway, when Arthur passed away, he left all of his literary materials to Carl. So Carl was not just a brain scientist. He had a very broad interest. His wife, or partner, I'm not sure which, because there was an issue there, but about a previous wife that wouldn't sign the divorce papers. I don't know if you got that straightened out or not.
My goodness, Leslie.
But for years and years, he has been with Catherine Neville. She's still active. You can find her website. She's one of the most interesting people on the planet Earth. I should mention her because often the women are left out. Well, Catherine, as a young lady, was a model, fashion model and photographer, very successful at that. And then she became a computer engineer. And she was so good she managed the whole system for oil for the Middle East for years as a computer person. In fact, Carl teased her that it was her fault we had the oil shortage back in the 70s, you know. And then she was a banker, and she was a bank president for a while. And in the process of being a bank president, she noticed certain flaws in security, and she tried to point them out. Nobody paid any attention to her, as it turned out. But she retired eventually from that and started to write novels, and one of her first novels is about a bank robbery. A very successful novel, and after people read that, she was actually called into Congress to testify about security issues. So being a bank president and then a computer engineer didn't do her any good on that, but after she wrote the novel, they all started to listen to her. I guess she's like Clancy, what's his name, that writes all those novels?
Tom Clancy.
Yeah, and he's been called into Congress as an expert on submarines and stuff. He only knows what he reads in the manuals, but anyway, that's what life is like. So that's Catherine. I think she's still writing novels, and they've been very successful in the world at large. I think bestseller in Australia, and I don't know what all. So she survives Carl. But Carl continued to work, and he's most famous nowadays for his holonomic or holographic view of the brain. And this was something he started working on in the 80s, and he knows what he's talking about. Holography is a mathematical affair. It's very complex, and I think that's one reason so few brain scientists have tried to deal with it. In fact, Carl's conferences were always populated with mathematicians and bioengineers, people with really high-end technical knowledge. Not your average on-the-street psychologist, for example, or neurologist. But he actually was a good friend of Dennis Gabor. Dennis Gabor was a British mathematician who invented holography, mathematically. And Carl knew him and actually went back to graduate school at midlife to take courses in physics and mathematics as he worked up this theory. And he became a strong proponent of the idea that the brain is holographic. or holonomic as he called it. And he has all kinds of evidence for that. We could talk about that for a long time, but I think it's one of the most important ideas of the 20th century. Unfortunately, most of the brain science community went the other way. They followed what you might call Alan Turing's kind of approach, where what the brain does, especially in vision, is more like signal detection, looking for lines, angles, colors, and so on, and putting those together the way you would if you wrote a computer program using one of the old programs like Fortran. Now, I'm sure this is not entirely wrong, but it's a dramatically different approach than Carl took. So while he was quite widely read by the general public, this part of his career really didn't make much of an impact on brain science itself. I'm sure that eventually it's going to come clean because it's either true or not. But he has all kinds of evidence for it, and he persisted with it, continued to do research right up to his death at 95. I think one of the things that really hurt his career was, what's his name, the British Crick, Francis Crick. Francis Crick disliked him with a vengeance, and I've never quite figured that out. I've talked to Carl about it. He didn't seem to understand either. But the British can be pretty arrogant, and I'll just say that. He didn't like Carl. He didn't like Carl's approach, and he would publicly say things like, well, Carl Friedman doesn't know much about the brain, he doesn't know much about holography, and he would make these statements that were patently wrong, but he had the high ground because he had Watson and Crick had got a Nobel Prize, of course, for discovering the structure of the DNA molecule. And Crick was then in California. Was it Caltech? Anyway, he had a lot of prestige, and he used it to say nasty things about Carl anytime he could. It was really kind of ridiculous. But so that was damaging to Carl's career. But I do believe that Carl's work is absolutely wonderful work, and the whole idea of the holographic brain, I think, has a lot of truth to it. And, given that fact, it can't stay under the covers forever. It helps explain things like why, when you open your eyes, you see a three-dimensional world outside of your head. Neurologists tell you that everything you see and experience is inside your head. But Carl's approach is quite different. It's like a hologram. You look out, and everything is out there where it's supposed to be. So he was quite a bright man, and he was a very kind and thoughtful person, and a wonderful person to hang out with. There was nothing arrogant about him whatsoever. It took me a while to figure out how famous he was or how many world-class awards he won, because he was just such an ordinary guy when you saw him, and he was just there was nothing arrogant about. There wasn't an arrogant bone in his body. So anyway, that was my experience with Carl. He's one of the people I really have loved and adored and admired over the years.
Great, thank you for that, Leslie. My initial introduction to Carl Friedman's work was in the 1980s, and on this issue of holography, he was touted as the neuroscientist affiliated with this Stanford-based company called Cybervision Systems, and they had a program called the Neuropsychology of Achievement, and their whole model was based on the holographic brain.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah, he did consultant work for a number of these companies.
Right, and while you were talking and you mentioned the holographic aspects and the Jenny Wade's book, Holonomic Theory, popped into my mind when you said that. And then I also just want to quickly mention when you brought up the experience that many of the astronauts had, and you mentioned noetic sciences. I believe that would have been Edgar Mitchell.
Yes, Edgar Mitchell, who was a wonderful person himself.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then when I was just thinking about that, I was thinking that if I recall correctly, there's a CIIS alumna who's now the president of Noetic Sciences.
Oh, I don't doubt that. I don't know for sure. I sort of come and go But they're a great organization. Actually, they're right down the road from me, and I go down there to meetings once in a while. I knew the original founder, whose name escapes me right this second, for it to come to me. He was a wonderful fellow. He was an engineer from Chapel Hill, as a matter of fact, and they've gone through several administrations since then. But their idea, and his idea originally, was to do research on the edge of science. That is, science has certain problems that they're dealing with, and you can get grants for. But there are problems, and they're right on the side of that are very close. They're not outside the pale, as they say, but they're not being funded. For one of their projects, for example, was to look through the human body for a healing system or a communication system for healing. That may be old hat now, but at the time, all you heard about was the body's defense systems. And so a healing system was an idea that hadn't been researched. Well, the Noetics Institute was researching that. Of course, they have Dean Radin there. Dean is one of the leading psi researchers. He's the guy who's done all the research with these little eggs that produce random radiation, emission of particles, and it's fundamentally a random process. And he's been able to show that at the times when lots of people are focused on a particular thing, like 9/11 was a very good example, these random pods all over the world bump up and show a certain correspondence. So somehow consciousness is affecting matter there in a very clear kind of way.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I just want to shift the conversation just a little bit, Leslie. I think our audience will be interested to and I'm interested in this too. You brought up Ken Wilber's name, and you guys are friends, and you have worked together and have a collaborative process. Can you tell our audience what led the two of you to come up with the Wilber-Combs matrix, and how you originally met Ken Wilber?
Well, we were both writing about consciousness and writing about similar problems. Only difference is he was famous and I was obscure.
A very minor difference.
Yeah. Well, I started out as a physics major. Of course, that doesn't make me that much different than him. I guess he started out in chemistry. But I was used to thinking about things in terms of topology, so I was drawing pictures, graphs, if you will, and I was very impressed by the periodic table. Just the story of it, it was invented by this Russian chemist who liked to play chess and stuff, and he cooked it up in his head on a train ride. He was trying to think of how to organize the different chemical elements that we know about in order to present it to a class of students. And didn't he cook up the periodic table? And then it turns out that the periodic table of elements is very not only valid but predictive. There were certain elements predicted and so on, later discovered to be real. So I came up with this idea of a periodic table of consciousness. That's what I called it. And it was just the idea that people have different levels of maturity, and we all have different states of consciousness. So let's put these together in a table and see what comes out of that. Ken read that, and he pointed out rightly, although I was a little annoyed at the time, he said, "Oh, yeah, I came up with that idea years ago. It's back in," and he mentioned this book on page 835 in the footnote and so on. It was like, of course, reading Ken Wilber is like reading the Bible. Anything is there somewhere. I said, "Okay, Ken, well, you haven't done much with you, have you?" Well, that's Ken for you. So, but he liked the idea of putting it in the table, and he's always given me credit for at least being halfway with him on it. So I have to say that, because Ken's the kind of guy who, when he gets an idea, he owns it. It's his idea. He doesn't really think, oh, this idea was really cooked up by Plato and so on and so forth. So when you read his stuff, people get the wrong impression that he came up with all these ideas. Well, Ken himself is not arrogant. He just gets excited about ideas and forgets where they came from. But he's always kept my name associated with that. But Ken was interested in some particular stages of development, especially from John Gebser. And he was interested in particular states of consciousness, especially from mysticism. So he framed the Wilbur-Combs matrix. So when you'll see, if you plug it in Google, you get hundreds of pictures of it. What you see is not just any state of consciousness like I was interested in, drug states, dreaming, deep fatigue, and so on. No, he was interested in these classic mystical states that are also seen in Eastern philosophy. So when he put this together, that's what he used. And he came up with a brilliant diagram that has been used by theologians and a lot of other people ever since. So that's how that came along. He and I, we weren't on real good terms at first, I'll say. I felt like he was distant and arrogant. It turns out I was completely wrong. I was one of those people that just assumed that because he was famous and I didn't have his email address, that he must... Well, you'd be amazed. I mean, people seem so far away until you actually talk to them. And somehow I got his email. Oh, he wrote me an email. And we started to correspond, and so we went from being nasty to each other very quickly to being friendly. And we do have our differences, but he has always been generous and kind in his interactions with me. I know he's not an academic. He doesn't try to be diplomatic. He's not nasty. He just doesn't try to be diplomatic. So if somebody says something he disagrees with, he'll just say they're wrong. I don't care who they are. And people get very offended at that with him, and he's not apologetic. On the other hand, he's not really nasty. It's just his style. So we got along quite well, and actually his work on consciousness was a bit difficult, and he asked me to write a book about it. So my book, Consciousness Explained Better, really was written with his encouragement to try to clarify and make easy to understand his notions of consciousness, which I don't disagree with. In fact, pretty much do agree with him. But the one thing I seem to be good at, or used to be good at, was taking difficult ideas and writing them in a way that was approachable and understandable. So that's how that book got written.
Leslie, I'm listening to you, and what I was thinking is the one thing that I think our audience might find interesting here is, can you give an example of where you and Ken don't see eye to eye?
Yeah, there aren't very many of them because I'd rather switch and fight on most cases, or I don't, as my wife says, I don't have a dog in this fight. Interesting phrase, isn't it? I don't have a horse in this race, if you prefer. But where we do differ, although we're friendly with each other, is the idea of development through these like magic, mythic, and mental, and so on. Gefter's idea is that as you grow, you carry all of them with you. That's a very Jungian idea, too. The unconscious is really the realm of the magical, in a way, and some of the magical aspects of the human mind are music is a magical production, and there's nothing rational about music. Poetry, love, and so on are all magical. And mythic is, you got poetry, you got wonderful stories, all kinds of stories, epic stories, and religions essentially are stories. So those are all those are not rational, they're not logical. So my idea is that a really whole integral person has all of those. Enjoy music, enjoy poetry, have a religious side, and so on. Ken really sees development more the way a cognitive psychologist would, that you move up the scale, and as you move up the scale, the whole center of your personality moves up. So that when you become a really rational person, it's the rational mind that really rules your life. And these other, magic and mythic become less important, or maybe fall away completely. The example Ken uses is, for example, we all, have biological processes. We use the bathroom and so on, but they don't rule us, except maybe when we're an infant. So the mind controls all those things. So Ken sees it more as a vertical ascent, in which the higher functions eventually control the lower functions. That's a kind of a psychological, cognitive psychologist view. I'm more Jungian in a way. I think that all the processes need to be up and going and working together. So that's a more romantic view.
Well, Leslie, who knew? This is that's it. I've been enlightened. In fact, I like your perspective because what I've never met Ken Wilber, and I hope to meet him at some point. In the backyard, have over a beer. The thing is, I don't know when that would happen because I have yet to visit Denver. In any event, when you were talking, the visual that I had was of the Penguins of Madagascar animated cartoon where there's a character called Kowalski, and he's all about science, and he's severe left brain. And there's an episode where they come under attack, and Kowalski is the last man standing, he because the left hemisphere in terms of logic is much slower in terms of when you have to in an emergency situation, right? And so there he is under attack, and he says, well, let's see. He goes, if I use my right hand, then I do this. He says, I use my left hand. And so when you were talking, that's what I was thinking, that I am, I can say this very clearly, I am with you at 100% level there, because on the Jungian side, one of the really amazing things that Carl Jung came up in his model with this issue of the inferior function, and that you have a primary function, an auxiliary function, a tertiary function, and this inferior function, and the goal is to be able to raise up the fourth function, which is the fourth function is an access doorway into the unconscious. Now, of course, that's controversial to people that don't think that exists, or that, if they take the other view, for example, that dreams don't have any meaning other than you're shaking out the cobwebs from the day. There's no archetypal or super consciousness, etc. So when you said that, I just wanted to say that I agree with you, and I think that's quite fun. I could imagine having a conversation with Ken, and it'll be like I'll be playing the conga drums. I go, oh yeah, and the other piece was when you were talking, Leslie, what it made me think of, and this is how I know you're right, is that from a neuroscience standpoint, what your perspective would be like whole brain synchrony, which is that the harmonization of left and right hemisphere, prefrontal lobes, the limbic system is talking to the brainstem, it's working in harmony. Right.
Well, I do have to say, before we leave the topic completely, that I notice, I'm talking about classic Ken Wilber, some years back when I knew him well. I notice in his more recent work he makes many references to Jung, and he even talks about the shadow some. So,
excellent.
I think he's softening on that, but I haven't really tried to keep track of it in detail.
Okay, so Leslie, I want to thank you for being our guest today. This is a marvelous conversation, and although this is our second one, I look forward to another conversation with you, because I feel like we just touched the tip of the iceberg.
We could do that.
I do want to say this, Leslie. I've said to Bob from time to time, in terms of logic in the left brain, maybe not exactly the way I'm going to say it now, humans can get as easily lost in logic as they can in myth and magic. So, somehow taking a step back and getting a clear perspective on your own thought process to know, wait a second, maybe in this situation, let me think this way or look at it this way. Be analytical, or just go with your intuition and go with your dreams, and it's just matching it to the situation. So it's not necessarily one or the other, just a beautiful orchestration of how you're going to think and act.
Well, I'm with you.
Well, Leslie, it has been a pleasure, and I especially like seeing so much of your humor in our interview today. If you would, Leslie, let our listeners know how they could get in touch with you if they'd like to and learn more about the many things that you do. What is the best way for our listeners to contact you?
Well, the best way is by email. I do a lot of email. Probably the best email would be just my name. I'm at CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies. So I have a very simple email. It's just A. Combs, ACOMBS. I go by Leslie a lot, but my real first name is Allan. So it's A for Allan, Combs, COMBS, all is one word, A. Combs, at CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, .edu.
Okay, fantastic.
Well, and I would just say that I'm not hard to Google. If you Google my name, Allan Combs, ALLAN, COMBS, you'll get several hits that will take you to email addresses.
Excellent. I'm glad that you're well known now.
Thank you.
So again, listeners, you can contact Leslie at his email with his first name of A for Allan, A. Combs at CIIS.edu. Also, Google him, and one of his websites where you can learn more about Leslie and what he does is sourceintegralis.org. That's sourceintegralis.org.
Google Allan, ALLAN, Allan Combs, COMBS. You'll get my website. There's a radio announcer with a similar name you'll see some hits for, but I'm not hard to find on Google anymore.
Okay, great. We love it. We will look for you there. Thank you, Allan. It's been wonderful having you on the show again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Leslie, right before we wrap up, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you publicly for being a kind mentor to me and for helping me to evolve my own creative capacities by pointing out my ability to synthesize, distill, and connect both similar and dissimilar concepts and ideas, and the fact that was a seemingly high-level skill set that I had mostly taken for granted. I want to thank you for acknowledging me in that way. And so with that said, I'd like to ask you to briefly share with our audience how you came to found the Consciousness Society in San Francisco and what your vision for the society is going forward.
Yeah, I've been interested in consciousness and all sorts of aspects of the study of consciousness, as you know, most of my life. And while there are conferences going on, especially on the West Coast, on consciousness, there really has been no professional society of consciousness researchers. Well, there is actually one, but it really focuses on neurology and brain research mostly. So I started this Society for Consciousness Studies that is for consciousness researchers or people who are seriously interested in consciousness research. And it's grown. There's over 150 members right now. The Graduate Institute of Connecticut is an independent master's program where I co-direct a master's program in consciousness studies there. The society has been very successful for bringing consciousness studies people together. There's really been no venue for doing that in the past. So that's the story of the society and where it's going.
Okay, great, Leslie. What final thoughts or key idea would you like our audience to take away from today's broadcast?
Oh, my, I don't know about final thoughts. Keep an
what
open
unfinal
mind.
thought?
Keep an open mind and be curious is about all I could say right now.
Okay, wonderful. Leslie, I want to thank you so very much for being our guest today, and I want to thank our audience for listening. Wherever you are, in whatever time zone you are in, we welcome and look forward to your comments about our show. Please contact us through our website with your feedback and suggestions. Remember, listeners, if you'd like to experience the same benefits our coaching clients get with us and learn how to get control of your schedule or easy ways to dissolve your chronic pain, stress, or anxiety, feel free to call us at 954-900-2179. Mention that you heard our Stress Free Now podcast show, and your first session is absolutely free. Call today to schedule your appointment. For Christine Wright, this is Dr. Robert Wright Jr. of www.stressfreenow.info. Until next time, be safe and be well.